Right, Robin Aitken, thank you very much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to talk to you. Wondered if I could pick up on a few points of your recent book, The Noble Liar. When was that published?
It was published. When was it published? It was almost a year ago. Yes. So,
okay.
So it was November 2018. That's right.
Yeah.
November 2018.
And it covers such a lot of ground. So who knows how long we'll be today, but we'll try and pick up on one or two of the points. And if it's okay, I'll just go through the book and the points as they occurred to me. And if you want to raise anything else, then please do that. And obviously, you worked with the BBC. And one of the first things you raised in your book, which struck me, was around the concept of meritocracy. And you said that the BBC was a meritocracy, and you thought that that was a bad thing. Would you elaborate on what you meant?
Yes. The word meritocracy, it was coined by a sociologist and political advisor by the name of Michael Young. He was a Labour man, and he was very prominent in Labour circles in the 40s and 50s. And in the early 1960s, he published a novel called The Rise of Meritocracy. As I say, it was his coinage, so he invented the word. And in Michael Young's view, the novel, by the way, is set in some years hence, set in the future, and Britain is at a situation where the meritocrats, that is, the clever people who've passed the exams and got all the good jobs, are in charge. And this sets up a tension in society. The people who are not so clever, who haven't done the exams, who are not the winners, if you like, in this system, rise up and try to overthrow the system which is governed by the meritocrats. And Michael Young wrote that book as a warning. His underlying theory was this, that a meritocracy is all well and fine, and in a sense accords with common sense, because why wouldn't you want the cleverest people who pass the most exams to be in charge in society? Fine. But, and this is a subtle but I think very strong point, he says if those people do rise to the top and take control, they do so feeling themselves to be justified in that situation. So they feel that their their control over society has been earned through their own efforts. And he contrasts this with an earlier formation of society where you had an aristocracy, which of course is an hereditary system. Somebody who was at the top in that system was, in Michael Young's view, slightly restrained and constrained by the notion that their prominence was good fortune. It was not earned.
Right.
And the problem with a meritocracy is that, in Michael Young's view, is that with it comes a great sense of entitlement. So those people who get to the top feel they've earned the right to be there, and feel that because of their cleverness and their merits, they're in the right.
And would your argument, and perhaps Michael Young's, be therefore that actually the meritocracy is almost hereditary?
Yes. No. I mean, we've arrived at this peculiar situation. It's a real it's anomalous, but we seem to have arrived at a situation where we do have an hereditary meritocracy, because the people who get to the top are clever, well-educated people. Their children, they make sure their children are well-educated, and because of the genetic inheritance, their children are likely to be above average intelligence, and so you get the system building on itself. And so you get clever parents get to the top, they have children, their children go to the best schools, they go to the best universities, they get the best jobs, and so it goes on. It's a continuation. And interestingly, Michael Young, when he coined that word meritocracy, he expected it. He was not using it in any sense in an approbationary sense. He did not approve of the idea, and he was horrified By the 1990s, when Tony Blair got into power, he was horrified that actually meritocracy had become a term of approval. That, in fact, he wrote an article shortly before he died, denouncing the idea of meritocracy. He said he'd written his novel as a warning to society, not as a blueprint for how society should be turned out. So when Tony Blair said he wanted society to be a meritocracy, Michael Young was horrified.
So what's the alternative?
A good question. The alternative is a society where meritocracy is balanced by obligation. So I don't think there is a realistic alternative in British society today to a system based on achievement through exam results, because it is the sort of foundation of the educational system, and clearly you want the best people at the top. But the point is that if the meritocracy is dominated by a set of ideas and a set of viewpoints which are homogeneous right across, everyone goes, it means that you get a class at the top of society, a meritocratic class, which thinks the same and feels that it knows best. And the meritocracy that we have is a meritocracy which has left far behind it traditional notions of service to society and also traditional morality. So I think that's the problem.
So something the BBC could do then is look at making opportunities for people from different types of background who nevertheless demonstrate skill and ability and potential.
Yes, I mean, what you have in the BBC is an organisation like any other organisation in one sense. Organisations hire people according to whether someone's going to fit in. And it's a self-perpetuating system.
IBM syndrome, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, it happens. It would happen in a computer company. It would happen in the armed services. It happens everywhere. People in the position of sitting on hiring boards, doing job interviews, they want people who are going to fit into the organisation. And so what you get is an organisation which has an internal cohesive culture. And that's what you have in the BBC. And I mean, you put your finger on it. The BBC needs to have a more diverse workforce in terms of outlook and beliefs. And
that's something society struggles with more generally, I think, equality of opportunity. We're tending to focus at the minute on equality of outcome because that's almost easier to get balances at the other end, but equality of opportunity is a challenge. Do you think our current parliament is entirely a meritocracy, i.e. made up just of talented people? And I ask that because I don't. No. I think there's a great range of talent.
Yes.
Let's put it that way.
I think actually you make a very good point. And, you, like me, like most of us, have probably read a lot of comment pieces in recent years about the dearth, for instance, of working class folk in the Labour Party. There was a time, certainly when I started in journalism back in the 70s, you would often find that an MP, a Labour MP, would be someone who'd come up through the union ranks, perhaps had started in a fairly lowly job and had gone up the union road and become an MP. And that was right and proper and an excellent outcome because it meant that those people, that MP, had a real connection, knew what it was like to work at the coalface, for instance. And that's a good thing. That's a very good thing. It's essential that you get people, that a system, a political system, is open to all comers.
Yep.
Of course, that presupposes you have to have certain aptitudes. You have to be able to speak and persuade, but so
and to grasp some fundamental concepts.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So you have to have a sort of native wit and cunning, even if you're not highly educated. But it's not. But we're getting. I think what's happened in politics actually is that it has become more meritocratic, and it has become something it never was when I was young, which was a clear career path for young people at the outset. I think there were very few of us, of my generation, going back to that, I was born in the 1950s. I think then it was something that people tended to do later in life, having achieved something else. Now, a lot of young people go in as political advisors, or they go to work for a think tank or something, and they see that as a first step on a career path which will lead them into Parliament. And I think that's a bad thing, actually, because I think that what it does, it erodes the connection between everyday life and politics. And politics and politicians then come to be seen as a separate caste, a sort of political class, which is separate from the rest of us. And, you know, if you haven't taken those first steps, if you haven't worked for the think tank, if you haven't been to a high-powered university, and you don't become a political advisor, then the political career is not open to you. You couldn't
afford to work for free for a good long time.
And that's a very bad thing. You know, what we need to rediscover some of those old pathways into politics, which I think used to be there.
You also touch on quite a few taboos in your book, including IQ, and the fact that that's something we're almost not allowed to talk about. Do you want to elaborate upon that a little bit?
Well, there is research by respected and thorough scientific researchers which suggests that there is a heavy genetic component to IQ. And this strays into
that instantly gets people's backs up.
Yes, it instantly gets people's backs up. Yes, because it suggests that you can't have equality of outcomes because the dice are loaded from the start. You know, we are differently endowed. We have different aptitudes. We have different native intelligence, and so however you try to create a system where there is equal opportunity, you're still not going to get equality of outcomes because people are endowed differently, and that is a real problem. And of course, where this becomes truly controversial is in where it touches on racial characteristics. So it's clear, most of this work has been done in the US, and it's clear over a period of time, it has become clear that certain racial groups outscore others. You've got a very interesting situation which has arisen in the Ivy League universities at the moment in America, because they have been discriminating against Asian Americans. These are...
Because they have too many places.
Yeah, I mean, these are Americans, young Americans of Chinese American ancestry by and large, and they regularly outscore other racial groups. And of course, that sets up an immediate tension in a society which is riven by neuroses about race. And so it's a very, very hot topic. So I can see why it's controversial. But I think that...
So do you agree with positive discrimination, that the idea that somebody gets a pass to a school above what their academic ability would say they would normally go to? Do you agree with that kind of approach?
No, I don't. I think that what you're doing there is you're trying to counter one unfairness by introducing another. Because in that system of positive discrimination, someone is also going to be, someone's going to be a winner. Yeah. So you might be favoured because you've got the right skin tone. Yeah. But inevitably that's going to displace somebody else who's got the wrong skin tone.
And Malcolm Gladwell, I don't know which one of his books, He talks about the fact that people in certain quartiles of outcomes from university graduate levels, if you like, so the top 15% always go on to do this in the industry, the next 15% always go on to do that in the industry, and the bottom 15% never really get anything done in the industry at all. And his argument is it's much better to go to a college where you will be in the top 15% rather than a college where you will struggle to maintain the bottom 15. And in terms of your life outcomes, that's a much more sensible route. That was quite profound. I don't know, I can't remember his evidence base for that, but I thought that was quite profound.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very, I think that societies struggle to achieve fairness. And we are at the same game as the Americans in some respects. And the problem is that, well, you've just mentioned one of the problems, which is that someone who is, if you like, artificially given a leg up into a situation where their natural aptitudes would not have got them to. They might struggle in that situation, and that might actually be a very poor outcome for them eventually. But
it's not to say we shouldn't do as much as we can to identify people with potential and give them the opportunity to succeed, which for whatever reason, it's something we might touch on when we talk about marriage later on. So for whatever reason, their environment hasn't enabled them to do what they could otherwise have done.
Well, that's certainly true.
Yeah.
And, the educationists would scream blue murder at the suggestion. But for instance, if you had raw IQ testing at a young age, and you said, well, actually this is what the Chinese do, actually more or less, as I understand it. They screen children, the most gifted children are pushed through the education system as far as they can go. Now, in pure economic terms, of course, that makes sense, because the most important raw material in any society, the most important reserve that we have, is the intelligence and endeavour of our own people, and you want to make best use of that. The problem it sets up, of course, is that some people are going to get left behind. But the answer to that, in my view anyway, is to encourage people in the aptitudes that they have. And we have set up a system where we put a premium on intellectual endeavour and achievement, and we undervalue certain other aptitudes and gifts which people have.
Yes, it's that thing about not how intelligent are you, but how are you intelligent?
Indeed.
Which is a fundamentally different thing, isn't it?
Exactly.
So, speaking about intelligence and ability, you mentioned, or otherwise, depending on who you're talking to, you mentioned Dominic Cummings, and you mentioned his influence. I wonder, and this, of course, you wrote this before the current government situation. Elaborate on what you mentioned in the book and why you thought it was relevant to put that in there.
Well, Dominic Cummings has become an absolute bugbear. I mean, it's a bit
like talking about IQ. It gets people's backs up.
Yes, absolutely. And yet, Dominic Cummings, I think, has a very clear-sighted take on an aspect of education which has struck me. After the referendum result, Cummings wrote something where he said that contrary to what one might expect, higher educational levels do not necessarily bring with them open-mindedness.
Well, that's the point you made. That's
yes.
right. Better educated, less open mind.
Exactly. And which is a very interesting point, because one might assume that the point of education is to bring people to a point where they are equipped for intellectual discovery, they're equipped for argument, and they'll make up their minds, if you like, on the evidence. But actually that's not how it works. it appears that in fact people who are very highly educated are very closed-minded in the sense that they cannot believe ever that their opinions are the wrong, that they are wrong. And when you think about it, this makes perfect sense. I mean, the point Cummings was making was this, that it was pointless trying to argue highly educated people out of their position. He was talking about in the Leave Remain
because they've thought it through and they're
yes.
set and they're not going anywhere. Yeah.
And one of the most striking metrics out of the EU referendum, the Brexit referendum, was that the more highly educated you were, the more likely it was that you'd be a Remainer. And Cummings was saying, well, there's no point arguing with these people because you won't convince them that they're wrong because they're so highly educated. They know they're right because, I'm highly educated, therefore I must be right. I've got my PhD, therefore my opinions, are backed up by all this.
So it's back
education.
to that entitlement thing.
Exactly. And I think that's a very, to me, that was a very potent point, because I've often been struck, and I was struck with in the BBC, at the uniformity of opinion. So it was very unusual in the BBC in my time, and it's a few years since I left, but I think probably, if anything, it's got more pronounced since I left.
Right, your colleague Mr. Humphreys would agree with you.
Yeah. That actually, it's rare to come across people who dissent from a particular political viewpoint.
Yeah.
And most people in the BBC, certainly in the editorial ranks, the producers, the reporters, these people are all highly educated. They've all been through the system.
But then we find activists are more likely, or people who are activists are more likely not to be able to understand the other side's point of view neither. And they sometimes are highly educated, sometimes aren't.
True.
So that just leaves a strange group in the middle who are open to dialogue.
Yes. It's, one of the, I'm sure we've all experienced this, over the past couple of years since the referendum, it's been very interesting to me the way in which this particular topic has divided opinion, and people have taken up positions which are so hard and fast and just not open to any discussion or persuasion. They know what their position is and they're sticking to it.
It's ideological, isn't it, really?
It is, and it's and the reason for it, I think, must be actually a deep psychological reason. The passionate Remainers. What is it exactly about the EU, an organisation which a lot of Remainers, if you ask them about it, find plenty of fault with it. It's not as if it's a perfect organisation, but there's something about what the EU stands for, which has engendered this sort of fierce enthusiasm.
To the degree where you have concepts like the intellectual dark web now and the heterodox academy, places where people feel they've got to stand aside from normality in order to have a reasonable discussion.
Yes.
Which is a kind of an interesting reflection, isn't it? You referred to the BBC being Michael Young's word made flesh, which I thought was quite interesting.
Yeah, well, I mean, you would look hard and you'd look long and hard to find an organisation which was more meritocratic, if you like, than the BBC. Tony, you don't get into the BBC just. It's a struggle for people to get there. People fight hard to get jobs at the BBC, and of course they do, because it's a good place to work. Yeah.
So, on touching on some of the no-go areas, which you seemed happy to go down, which was you mentioned Trump, you mentioned housing and immigration, and again you say what many people would say is obvious. The fact that housing is in short, it's basic demand and supply. When you let lots more people into the country, you have a limited housing stock which raises the price of housing. and pushes it out of the reach of most people. It's basic economics. What's the solution there? Because again, you've got two diametric, it seems, polarized opinions of open borders on the one hand and closed borders on the other.
Well, there are two solutions, or two possible solutions. Either you build enough houses for everyone coming into the country,
which we can't physically do because there aren't enough builders or bricks, but yeah.
Yeah, so there are physical constraints on the rate you can build houses, or you can restrict immigration to a certain extent. I mean, I noticed last week there were some statistics which came out which said that in the next decade, we're likely to have another 3.5 million people in the country. And Britain's total population will rise to 70 million. Now, I've nothing against immigration. I think healthy societies have a certain degree of immigration. You know, there is a certain amount of population churn. People come and people leave, and that's quite right and proper. And that's what a free society, it's part of what a free society should be. And
with a name like Rachinsky, I'm not going to argue with you there, but
quite. So it's you know, but the problem has been over the past 30 years, 40 years possibly, is that immigration has been relatively unconstrained. And what that does, it sets up strains in local communities. And this is not an effect which is spread evenly across the country. There are some parts of the country where immigration hardly touches them. And there are other communities where you get a sudden influx of people, often drawn by the prospect of work in a particular industry which is centered locally. And then you get an imbalance in the local community, and the indigenous population, if you can call them that, the people who were there before, people who've always lived there with their families, feel a sense of resentment. And I think that's perfectly natural. And I think what the problem that we've had in this country is we haven't had a candid debate about immigration. And it was very striking to me that in the BBC for many years, immigration was a taboo subject. It was something that you couldn't make programs about. No one wanted to talk about it. We simply would not allow that discussion to happen. And the consequence of that was that there was no pressure on the politicians to do anything about immigration until suddenly, and I think this was a factor in the referendum, it became a factor in the referendum because people had the opportunity to say something about immigration or to make their feelings known. Partly, I think the result in the referendum was partly driven by unease about the level of immigration. And that was the first time many of them had been able to cast a vote. And I'm sure that was one of the factors. I don't say it was the main factor or even the biggest factor, but I think it was one of the factors which gave us the result that we had. And I think it was because we had suppressed a candid debate about immigration, a debate that every society should be able to have. There is no more fundamental issue than who should be allowed to come and live in the country. And I also think that it's quite, it's a sort of madness to expect that people who have always lived in the country and whose families have always lived in the country do not feel a rightful sense of entitlement as to what that country should provide for them, as opposed to what it should provide for recent incomers. You know, I think it's very easy to understand the sense of disgruntlement that people feel when they see immigrants coming in, getting scarce council housing or scarce social housing when they can't get it themselves. And that sort of thing, you know, really gets people angry.
Yeah. So Douglas Murray, I think, in his book, The Strange Death of Europe, I think he talks about or relates it to digestion. You know, if you try and eat too much at once, you're going to have an upset tummy, and maybe that's one of the situations that we've got going on at the moment.
Yes, I mean that's that's my little analogy about it. I mean, I think that a healthy society, like a healthy gut, can digest a certain amount of immigration.
That's right.
And to me, it seems. I mean, it's a metaphor, but I think that Britain has been blessed actually with pretty good community relations compared with many other countries, and we have shown a traditional and historic tolerance to immigration. But if you allow too many people in too rapidly, you're going to upset the balance.
And the locus of control thing is an interesting one, because there are globalists who would like, I'm sure, one global government that controlled everyone and everything, right the way down to, I remember in a previous guise, I was around a table talking about mental health services in Wales, and somebody from Bridgend said, well, if you people in Cardiff think you're going to tell us what people in Bridgend what to do, you've got another thing coming. And, didn't want to be controlled by any edicts coming out of Cardiff because they were Bridgend. And fair enough, So it's interesting to that argument of where the locus of control for a country lies. I would like to vote for the people who make the laws that govern my life. That's where I come from. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable aspiration. And I don't think that's as directly possible in Europe as it is with the UK Parliament.
No, that's exactly right. I mean,
although it doesn't seem to be possible in the UK Parliament at the moment.
No. The problem with the EU, or one of the big problems as I see it in the EU, is that the influence of the individual voter is so attenuated that the individual citizen has virtually no impact whatsoever on the way the supertanker, the route the supertanker is taking. Right. And that sets up a real problem in a democracy or a notional democracy like ours. I mean, the notion of subsidiarity, it's an interesting notion, subsidiarity. It actually, I think, originates, it was a Catholic doctrine, actually, a Roman Catholic doctrine, which emanated from Catholic social teaching. The idea that the decisions in society should be made at the lowest possible level. So a decision about local schools should be made by local politicians. A decision about sex education should be made at the family level. And so the problem with centralization, when you've got an overweening central power and a central bureaucracy, is that, of course, people at the local level naturally feel entirely overlooked and forgotten. And whilst that isn't always necessarily true, there might well be a bureaucrat who's actually looking out for you, but you don't feel that. And actually, democracy is, I think, all about, there has to be an emotional attachment to the system. And that emotional attachment has been there with our parliament for many generations. I think at the moment it's really frayed. And the problem with the European Parliament and the European Council and all the other elements of the superstructure which made up the EU is that people felt no emotional attachment with them whatsoever. Most people couldn't tell you, what the Council of Ministers actually did, what the Commission does, what the European Parliament does. They didn't understand what the responsibilities of these various parts of the machine were, and they felt absolutely no connection with them. And under that circumstance, you get a very tangible sense of disengagement, which is very dangerous. And I think that was probably the overriding reason we got the result we did in the referendum, which was because people felt that this system, which notionally governs our lives, was one that they had no connection with, no control over.
So if I move on to the BBC and the church widely as a subject. You mentioned C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, and I've read an awful lot of books, and that's one of the only 5 books I've read twice. And I didn't know that it had been first broadcast on the BBC, which is quite interesting. You talk about the church being influenced by progressive attitudes, and that it's young radicals, and the whole discussion around that. Could you open that up a little bit for us?
It's a very actually I didn't know the story before I wrote the book, and actually one of the good things about writing a book is that it teaches you quite a lot. And I didn't know this history about the way in which the Church of England was the midwife, if you like, in some respects, of the welfare state. There was this man, Archbishop Temple, who wasn't Archbishop very long. He became Archbishop, I think, in the early war years, 1940. And he wrote a very influential short book, which was about the welfare state. In fact, it was he who coined the phrase the welfare state. And I think that what that demonstrated to me was the way in which the welfare state, that is a state which looks after those people who are least able to look after themselves, provides for the needy, is actually the natural outgrowth of a Christian sensibility. So Christianity is an empty creed if it does not yield fruit in the sense of helping the weakest. And
by their works you shall know them.
By your works shall you know them, exactly so. And it's all there in Scripture. It's all it's very basic stuff. This, but the Church of England then fed these ideas into society generally, and they were taken up with great enthusiasm by the left, particularly, and by the Labour Party in particular. And the 1945-50 government of Clement Attlee was a government which put into practice many of those ideas of Archbishop Temple, amongst them the ideas of a universal healthcare system. And Temple died, I think, in 1944, so he was a very short-lived Archbishop of Canterbury, and he's a sort of forgotten figure in a way. But what it did, I think, what then happened was that the Church of England, to a large extent, began to identify in certain ways with the left. So it saw the Labour Party as the political instrument to achieve many of the things that it wanted to achieve for society. And whilst many of those things are very good and have been of enormous benefit to us all, I think there was a sense in which the Church of England was almost captured by the Labour Party at one point. And
it's interesting.
I mean, if you run the film on a bit to the 1980s, there was a famous occasion where the Church of England bishops, a group of them, produced a paper called Faith in the City, which was about how these clerics thought cities should be organised and what should be done to improve life in cities. And Mrs. Thatcher reacted by denouncing the whole thing as a sort of Marxist plot. And I only mention that because it was indicative of the way that the right came to see the church, and conservative politicians came to see the Church of England and its clerical hierarchy as in some ways opposed to it. Whereas, I don't think that Jesus had much to say about economics. And I don't think, well, what I mean by that is I don't think that, for instance, it's clear from Scripture if he had a take on the PSBR.
Well, the poor you will always have among you is one thing I can think of at short notice. But
what I mean is that if there's a moral argument about how much a government should borrow.
Yeah.
Because if a government borrows too much and cannot pay its debts, then what that actually does is it hobbles society. It creates what you will get from that is a financial crisis of some sort, an economic crisis, which will actually be very hard on some people. So it was never clear to me. I know that some of the aspects of Thatcherism were harsh. Some of its outcomes were very difficult for individuals. But I think that it was done with the intention of strengthening society, although we had to take some harsh medicine for a while. And to me, that is a perfectly proper thing for a government to do. To say, look, we've got to pull ourselves up together. We've got to stop spending so much, and we've got to earn more, and we've got to be more productive. That's a difficult message for a government to give, but it's a necessary message.
Absolutely. So, no more strongly has the divergence possibly emerged between the classic church doctrine and the BBC than around family values, marriage, traditional family values. What do you think motivates the BBC? I mean, am I right? Is there a divergence, first of all? So that the Church of England or the Church and the BBC have parted ways on family values. In what way has that happened, and why do you think that's happened? Well,
I think that what you have in the BBC is a set of very liberal attitudes which have emerged and hardened into an ideology over a period of some decades. And I think of it now as, I think you've seen the growth of what I call a media morality.
Yeah.
And this is explicitly atheistic and secular. And it is based on the notion that a liberal, tolerant, permissive society will increase the sum of human happiness. So I don't think that liberals are wicked people, but I think they're deluded. I think that if you take, for instance, the question of divorce, divorce was promoted and sold to the country as a remedy for human unhappiness. So the argument was there were people trapped in unhappy marriages, and that by making divorce easier, you would actually make those people happier.
Oops.
Yeah. And I think that's a fallacy. That actually, if you say, we will make it easy for you to get a divorce, and it won't matter if you get a divorce. In fact, you will be happier and everyone will be happier. Actually, that's a lie. It doesn't work out that way. Your children will be unhappier. Your children will be upset by it. And also, it's based on this falsehood, which is that marriage is about romantic love, so that once you feel yourself to be out of love with your spouse, then that is the time you should get a divorce. Whereas actually, I don't believe that is true myself. I think that marriage is an institution designed to create happy, stable families. And in the long run, it is better for individuals to weather the inevitable storms that there will be within marriages. see it through and stick it out.
Hence the permanency aspect of it.
Exactly.
Because forever changes everything.
Yes.
It changes your arguments.
Yes.
If you know you're stuck together,
yes,
everything changes.
Which is not to say that a state should make divorce impossible.
No.
I think that it's wholly
adultery, abuse, abandonment.
Yes.
Reasonable grounds.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
falling out of love, changed my mind.
Yes.
Perhaps not so.
Not so.
Yeah.
Not so. And I also, I think maybe when there are no children involved, that also changes the equation to a certain extent.
And it's the children thing which seems to make a big difference statistically.
Yes.
That married families, for the large population base, children have remarkably better outcomes and become better members of society. And that's the big thing. If you want a decent, ordered society, then that seems to be the way to go statistically.
Well, healthy families are the bedrock of a healthy society. Yeah. Without them, you won't have a healthy society. The BBC is very reluctant to engage with this argument. And there are many current ills in society. For instance, the crisis in mental health amongst young people. Okay, where does that come from? If you listen to BBC debates about that, they're usually framed in terms of what are the resources, what are the mental health resources available on the NHS for young people? That's an aspect of the problem, but it doesn't get anywhere near the root of the problem.
Why it exists in the first place.
Exactly. Why are young people unhappy? And don't tell me that this is because they're on Facebook all the time. I'm not saying Facebook is a great help to their happiness, but I don't believe that it's the cause, the root cause.
It's a fruit, not a root, maybe.
Yeah, maybe so.
And what about the one woman, one man aspect? I mean, they seem to have, the BBC, for example, seem to have embraced this desire to abolish what they call heteronormativity.
Indeed.
Why and where's that come from?
The BBC underwent a huge change in the 1960s, 70s and 80s. And what happened was that a new generation of highly educated young people came into the BBC with radical ideas. Now, why was that generation of the 50s and 60s? Why was that generation so radical in its outlook? I think there's a very interesting, I don't have the answer to that, but I think it's something to do with the fact that our parents, so I'm of that generation, and my parents were fairly typical examples of it, I think. They were quite disciplined, they were quite self-restrained, they didn't believe in instant gratification, they were quite hard on themselves. And I think their children reacted against that, and there was a rejection of the values of that wartime generation. And that expressed itself in many different ways. And of course, it coincided with the arrival of television and the arrival of a mass media which was much more pervasive and much more comprehensive than it had ever been before. I mean, it's impossible for young people now to imagine the situation that when I was a young boy, for instance, when there was at first just one TV channel which was on for a few hours every evening, and the BBC was virtually all you could get, and that changed, and you had this generational change of radicalized young people who came in. They wanted to overthrow their parents' values and assumptions about society. And television and the mass media, the explosion of that, gave them the means to do so. And what emerged within the BBC was a very, what I term a transgressive morality. So everything was up for debate and everything was overturned. So it wasn't just divorce, although that was a big issue. It was also abortion. It was also pornography.
Absolutely.
So pornography now.
Well, you mentioned Lady Chatterley. We haven't got time to go into that. But that's very interesting.
It is very interesting. It's very interesting indeed. Yeah. The significance of that one court hearing and the way in which it has been identified subsequently by leading liberal spokesmen as the most important court ruling, because it undermined the assumptions which had been there forever and a day before that. And it's
finally then, what would you suggest we do about it all?
What needs to be done is that the BBC needs to be forced to engage with our arguments. And our arguments are realistic and reasonable arguments. So the argument I have with the BBC is this, that they frame their debates according to a set of beliefs and ideology which excludes the beliefs of people like me and millions like me.
Millions and millions.
Millions.
That's the thing.
I mean, I think of it as the silenced majority.
Yes.
I think there are many people in society who might not be explicitly religious. A lot of them would not be, but they understand the importance, for instance, of stable families, and they understand a sort of natural morality about what is right and what is wrong. You know, take pornography. I think people understand instinctively that pornography is a bad thing, but nothing happens about it. The legislators do nothing about it, and the BBC certainly is not interested in it as a subject, and certainly doesn't encourage any campaigns which would restrict pornography. Why not? Why is that? Because
so how do we get to that point where they listen to us? Or what is it just about money? Is it just about voting with your feet and withdrawing your license fee and not watching it?
Well, I think that could be a very potent weapon. I mean, I have always up to now paid my license fee. And I have done so because it's the law, and also because I have always hoped that the BBC would reform itself. And I'm not sure that optimism of mine is justified. So we might be approaching the point at which what we need is a concerted campaign for people to withhold their license fees until the BBC actually changes its tune on these matters and allows, this is really about free speech in a way, because there's a whole section of opinion, a great swathe of opinion in the country, which never gets a hearing on the BBC. So you would never hear the argument about childhood mental health, for instance, framed in terms of the breakdown of families. It's never framed in those terms. It's always framed in terms to do with resources or social media or all these other things which are sort of out there and of the moment. But actually, the real issue, as we've just said, it lies deeper than that, and they do not engage with it.
So you would say get on and complain?
Certainly.
Get on and complain, make sure that because numbers matter, don't they?
Numbers matter.
Get on and complain. If it gets to the point, withdraw your licence fee, then that might be a thing to do as well.
Yes.
Write to your MP, let your MP know that you're dissatisfied with the BBC.
Yes.
All these things eventually will have an effect, let's hope.
And also, I mean, I don't know if you just a few days ago, the senior politician was up in front of the Culture, Media and Sports Committee, Select Committee, just raised the possibility that maybe the license fee was not forever, that maybe it was time to look again at the license fee. And the reason for that was because fewer and fewer young people are actually accessing BBC services.
Interesting. So
the point is that the BBC needs our support in the long. It needs the support. The point about the compact between the BBC and the public is this: we all have to pay. We have to pay by law, but the quid pro quo is that we all get a fair hearing, and that's not happening at the moment. The BBC must be forced to recognise that and to do something about it. Because ideally, the BBC becomes what it says it always should be, an impartial news service. And if we could have that, that would be marvellous.
Reflecting society.
Reflecting society.
Yeah, yes. Absolutely right. Robert Aitken, thank you very much for your time. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
And you. Thank you, Tony.